pond management. We have all kinds of aquatic weeds and things that pop up sometimes that we need to manage. This is what this episode is here to do, is to help you figure out ways to manage that. I'm Steve Estes. I'm a county extension agent for Ag Natural Resources here in Taylor County, and I'm joined by Brittany Chesser, and she's a program specialist with Extension. She specializes in aquatic vegetation management. She's based out of College Station, and we appreciate her being on with us today and joining us for this episode. So starting off, Brittany, one big resource or very valuable resource that Extension has that's open to anybody throughout the state if they want to use it. There's a website called Aquaplant. And I use this quite a bit in my role as an extension agent when I get pond calls here at the office. Main thing is identifying plants and talking about how to manage them. So you want to talk a little bit about our Aquaplant website?
Yes, so Aquaplant is a website that was created about 20 years ago, and I'm going to show you kind of the front page for this. I now manage this. This has been passed down to me. And so here we have again aquaplant.tamu.edu. As you can see, this is our front page. So if you're someone who, maybe you stumbled upon this and you're really interested in fisheries, we do have a button that links directly to our fisheries web pages as well. But the main thing that really people come for are kind of meat and potatoes is this button right here, this identify a plant. So you can click on this. And this will bring people to 4 different classifications of aquatic vegetation. And these are really what we're hoping that if you're trying to identify something that you have going on in your pond, that you can at least identify, what category of aquatic vegetation it's in. Because we have a lot of different plants that like to get their feet wet, but they do have some different characteristics. So we have our algae, we have our floating plants, we have our submerged vegetation, and we have our shoreline vegetation. Each one of these are a little bit different. You can kind of see their general descriptions there, right out there on the screen. And so some of the main issues that we deal with are, some submerged vegetation. So we would click on this, and then essentially you would see common names and photos of things that might be in your pond. And so let's just say, for instance, we're going to click coontail. This is a native species, but we typically find this across the state. And so you would go to this plant profile, and we have different photos that you can blow up, make a little bit bigger, kind of compare. You can go over some different physical characteristics. Even though things might look similar in a photo, you might want to double check, are all the leaves underwater? Really simple things like that. You might need to get out a little bit of a ruler, but most of these are, pretty common terms. Then for each of our plant profiles, we have a how to manage this plant button. And that'll take you to our management pages where we have all of the effective known management options for that species. And so really at this point, this is where you would kind of need to do your research a little bit more, right? So we have a lot of different options. We have a lot of different examples. And so we're hoping that providing this, that you can kind of dig a little bit deeper and figure out what's best in your particular situation, because all ponds are not treated the same. And just to kind of go back to the front, most of the topics that we talk about, I might be referring to some of our aquatic vegetation fact sheets. And these are fact sheets that people can go on. They can click this button, and basically whatever fact sheet or topic they're interested in, they can download this or keep this on their computer. So things like triploid grass carp, if you're interested in adding them to your pond, we have a short 5-page document, pretty easy to read. And so kind of going back to this, some of the more common areas that we have are definitely, across the state. Every single pond owner at one point is probably going to deal with something like algae. And I would say that's our number one page. We actually can see page hits. And so a lot of people are clicking for different types of algae. And so this is one of the most common pages that people use, and a lot of these different species on this page.
So one of the big, it's funny you mentioned that because one of the main calls that I do get and have over the years as an extension agent usually deals back with filamentous algae. Pretty widespread, gets into a lot of ponds. Let's start off there. How do we control that and manage it in a pond?
Right. And so I'm going to bring up a slide here of our filamentous algae just so people can see a little bit closer up. And so one of the issues in terms of management is actually just not being proactive and, identifying what you have going on to manage it successfully. And so one of the big misconceptions is if you look at this middle photo here, I'll get these photos all day long in the summer, right? And people are saying, this just popped up in my pond. How do I kill this? And really, when we're getting into the warmer parts of the month, it gets a little bit tricky when we start talking about different types of control, just due to water temperature, especially if your fish or if fish are present. And so the misconception about filamentous algae is that these mats are actually different than maybe what's growing underneath. Maybe you see like green clouds. And so they're not different. They're actually just two different growth forms. And so the first thing in management is really knowing that when you start seeing these surface scums at the top of the water column, like you see in the middle photo, and then also on the left-hand side, they are kind of bubbly, slightly yellow, they kind of fall apart in your hand. This is already algae that's on its way out the door. Okay, so this is already dead, stressed, dying algae. And so you have to realize that even if you're going in to manage that, you need to manage the healthy filamentous algae that's growing underneath of it. And that's more of what we see on the right-hand side. As you can see, it looks more like wool. It's more intact. It's darker green in color. And obviously they have some surface mats in the background there as well. And so what I recommend is, going in, once you start seeing any type of green, dark green clouds in your shallow areas during the early spring. Um, Looking into your different types of management. And so when we start talking about filamentous algae and really just aquatic vegetation in whole, right? Our toolbox is very limited. And so, yes, you can use some type of physical or mechanical control to remove these mats. It's very heavy. This vegetation can be 4 to 6 tons per acre or more. It's very backbreaking work. And so typically this is something that landowners stray away from, unless if they have kids or grandkids that they can trick into, spending all day out in the pond. But again, these are just dead, dying mats. And so they're going to come back. So we
So
recommend,
if
sorry.
we're just removing that off the top, then we're really not taking care of the problem.
Exactly. And removing the mats is beneficial though, because you're removing those nutrients that they would be putting back into the water column. But just know that that's really not what you're actually trying to target. Some other options for filamentous algae are things like biological control. So using things like Mozambique tilapia, depending on what region you're in the state, you might have to get approval from TPWD. And Mozambique tilapia are really used best as part of an IPM or integrated pest management strategy with some form of chemical control. Only about 10% of their diet can be filamentous algae, and so they really can't keep up on the growth just using them alone. So that really just leaves us to mostly chemical control. And so when you think of algae, what do you think of when we start talking about chemical control?
I think of copper sulfate.
Exactly. So when we start talking about algae in that category, right, it's, a lot of people are just going to immediately think copper. And that's, one of the products that are labeled, as the highest effectiveness. But there's actually a couple of different forms of copper, right? And so we call them copper compounds. So we have our copper sulfate and we have our chelated copper. And just know that they're both heavy metals. The only real difference is, and there's a couple of other differences, but really what hits home for landowners is that chelated copper stays suspended in the water column for a few more hours, so it's able to hit some of those algal cells, or more of those algal cells than copper sulfate. Whereas copper sulfate doesn't stay as suspended as long, and within about an hour, it's going to sink to the pond bottom. Um, and so that's one of our main strategies is, using copper sulfate to target these healthy growing mats and then incorporating Mozambique tilapia maybe to help with when it's growing back, to help with some of that maintenance so you don't have to treat as quickly. And then something that we also want to address, especially if you're looking at that middle photo there, is prevention. So how did you get here, right? What is causing this issue? Is it too much sunlight? Is it too much nutrients? What's going on here so you don't have to go through this process as heavily next year?
So, Brittany, if I'm using copper sulfate and I have fish in the pond, is there some concern with my fish?
Yes, so there with any of our herbicides, right, or algicides, you should always be looking at the label and following the label. All this information is going to be on there, but some of the things that you should be keeping in mind is before you do any type of management, you should know your water chemistry in your pond. Essentially, one of the biggest issues that we see with copper is that you're looking at the label, right, and they might say that the maximum labeled rate is 1 part per million, um, and you need to follow the label is the law, right? But if your alkalinity, so if your water chemistry, your alkalinity, that's the buffering capacity of your water, if it's below 30, your toxicity of copper to fish increases. Okay. And so you want to make sure that your alkalinity is optimally above 50 parts per million, and at bare minimum above 30 parts per million if you have a fishery, to make sure that it is not as toxic at the labeled rate. You're also going to see on the labels that you want to treat in sections. And so with copper, copper is deemed as a contact herbicide, which means that it kills very quickly. We typically see injury within a few hours and total death within a couple of days. And so it happens really quickly compared to some of our other herbicides. And so when that happens, when everything starts decomposing all at once, beneficial bacteria are going to break that down. And so overall, just to kind of sum it up, decomposition comes at an oxygen expense. And so that's why if you went in and if you saw this middle picture like we have here, and you treated your entire pond with copper, you might have a fish kill. Okay, a low dissolved oxygen fish kill because you have so much rotting at once. And just know that when we get questions like this, it's not necessarily the copper that killed your fish, it's the applicator. It goes back to, looking back at the label, treating your pond in sections, no more than 25 to 30% of your total pond area should be treated at once if you're using a fast acting herbicide. You want to give it time for it to die off, usually about 2 weeks, and then you can move on and treat the next section if you're in a situation where you just have 100% coverage. And so that's really just to, help safeguard your fishery because, again, there are times where you're following the concentrations, you're getting that part right, but you're just treating too much at one time.
So we discussed fish, but what if I have livestock? I have cattle or sheep or goats, and this is their water source as well. It's copper toxic to them.
So you will see, if you look at either the label or we actually have a really good resource on Aquaplant, which I'm going to go to really quick. We just updated it, and it's our aquatic herbicide tables. And so you'll see at the beginning, it's going over effectiveness for each of these. But at the end, we actually have a water use restriction table. Okay, and so this is if you just kind of want like a quick reference in terms of, okay, is this safe for my livestock, right? Or do I need to wait a certain amount of time? And so we have all of these different uses that you could potentially use for your pond, things like livestock watering, which you were asking about. And you will see that when we're dealing with copper complexes, so this is our copper sulfate and chelated copper complexes, that there is a zero water use restriction for livestock when you're treating at the labeled rate. When we start getting into some of these other herbicides, when we're trying to maybe kill off some of our shoreline vegetation, that's when you're going to see, some differences, right? So indethol, for example, is another product that sometimes is mixed in with copper for certain types of algae control. There's a 7 to 25 day water use restriction. And so if you were someone who your primary goal was livestock watering, you would want to steer clear of that unless if you were able to provide alternative water sources.
Well, good. And so it looks like copper complexes, there's no really restriction if you're using it according to the label as far as watering. And even one other question that sometimes comes up, some people will pump out of a pond and then water some type of vegetation, maybe turf or crops. And looks like the copper complexes, if used by the label, are safe for that as well. Now, you mentioned
Mhm.
shoreline vegetation. One problem we see sometimes in our area are cattails, and they'll get started around a pond, around the shoreline, and if left unchecked, they'll multiply, and the next thing you know, the pond's almost unusable because there's too many cattails. Talk to us a little bit about cattails and how they get started, and then how to kind of stay on top of them and keep them managed.
Right. And cattails is another one across the state. We, deal with issues with just overabundance. And so I'm going to kind of pull up our cattails right here. Some of our, if you look at the top photo, that's some more of our dense stands that we typically get photos from landowners, whereas, maybe the bottom photo is something that people just want to make sure they stay in check. And so, normally you start seeing little tiny blades of grass coming up, in your pond. And, when people initially think of ponds, right? And if you think of a picturesque pond, right, that everybody paints, you see cattails in them, right? So, a lot of people will let them grow and they'll say, oh, this is great. It does, aquatic vegetation does provide roles, in the environment, right? We don't want your pond to be a fishbowl completely, and so we understand we want some vegetation. But when our cattails start getting out of control, it starts becoming an issue, right? So if you have a fishing pond, it's going to start snagging lines, or it's going to be hard to just cast in your pond in general. We also have a lot of insects that like to breed in these dense stands of cattails. And so, really, when we're talking about the overall goal of your pond, we're talking about you want about 30% coverage in your pond of aquatic vegetation total. And so when we're in these situations where we have really dense stands, again, we're going to go back to our toolbox, right? So mechanical control is something that a lot of people use improperly with cattails. They'll go in, they'll roller chop or do something like that, and they basically just propagated their cattails because they have these really thick root systems. There are ways to remove them mechanically. Most of the time, that's through dredging. And so, if you have landowners or if you're someone in a situation where cattails are completely covering your pond, that probably means your pond's too shallow, okay? And you probably need to go in there and deepen it out anyway, because we can manage it, but it's going to be hard to, um, you know, remove them. And then also come back and not have anything else established, right? Because at that point, we might be addressing a water clarity or a water depth issue. Unfortunately, there's no biological control. And so again, this is one of the ones where, if a landowner feels comfortable, we recommend chemical control. And it's a little bit different with our cattails, okay? Since these are, they have a lot thicker cuticles or basically just thicker, waxier vegetation, we're not going to be using something like copper sulfate or copper complexes. What's going to happen if you do use that, it might turn brown, it might get kind of spotty, but you're really not injuring it to the point where it's going to stop reproducing. So we like to use what's called systemic herbicides. And so these are herbicides that you would ideally with cattails, you would do a foliar application and then allow those cattails to suck up that systemic herbicide and it would get translocated down into the root system. So that's really what we recommend. Things like or systemic herbicides like glyphosate, imazapyr, triclopyr. And I do want to clarify something that when we're talking about any herbicides that you're using in an aquatic system, so that you're using in your pond, they need to be aquatically labeled. And so you can't just use the same thing. I know imazapyr, glyphosate, these are things that you all use to treat your turf or your fence line or in your pasture, but it has to be aquatically labeled to use it in a pond. So we're going to be looking at different products. And really, that's kind of with cattails, there's a couple of tips I have. One, it's best to treat shoreline vegetation in the fall when your shoreline vegetation is usually storing food for winter. So it's going to draw down more of that herbicide. The sweet spot for cattails is usually about the end of August, beginning of September. And then also when you're applying, don't go too hot on your concentration. We don't necessarily recommend the maximum labeled rate. Kind of go a little bit lower than that spray, and then 2 to 3 days later, follow back up with another application to make sure that you're working that herbicide slowly into the root system and you're not just killing off the leafy green material before the herbicide can get down to those roots. My last tip is to add in some type of activator adjuvant, which means that it's a product that you're going to add into your backpack sprayer or whatever you're using, and it's going to help the herbicide stick to the plant. Because if you imagine if I went out and if I sprayed this with a water hose, what would happen?
Sure, it's going to run off and into your water and it's going to spread everywhere.
Exactly. And so we want to make sure it sticks to the plant so you have a total kill. So using things like an aquatically labeled non-ionic surfactant or a methylated seed oil, it is really going to be key. And you could be doing everything right, and if you forget that step, you're not going to get good control.
Now, back to one of your earlier points, there are herbicides out there. They're mentioned like glyphosate or imazapyr that you can kill vegetation with, but there are aquatic versions of these herbicides. And one question I do get here at the office, taking glyphosate, for example, and many people know that as the main trade name is Roundup, but you don't really want to spray Roundup, for example, on your cattails or around an aquatic setting. There's another product called Rodeo, or there's others out there. They're the aquatic versions. So, Brittany, that's what you're talking about there is look for the aquatic version of these herbicides. They may be similar in active ingredient, but they are labeled for use and where it's a little safer around aquatic setting.
Yes, and just to quickly go back to that one herbicide table because I still have it pulled up, we have examples of commonly available trade names. So just like you said, Rodeo is an aquatic version of glyphosate, same thing as Roundup Custom. And so that way it kind of just gives you a direction to go in. So we can help you out a little bit more so you're not using things that you're not supposed to be using in your pond and breaking federal and state laws. We don't want that to happen.
Sure. So we covered a couple of big ones, issues that we have here in Taylor County in the Big Country area, which the filamentous algae, cattails. There are numerous other ones out there, but that's one good reason we have this aqua plant website is for your use to get on and check it out. You can do some research yourself there and a lot of great information. Are there any other real quickly aquatic vegetation that you would like to cover, Brittany, before we wrap up?
Yeah, so I have a couple more on here that are just really common again across the state of Texas. We frequently deal with them. I'm constantly writing recommendations. And so on the left, we have alligator weed. It's a non-native invasive species. As you can see in the larger photo there, it takes over very quickly. It's able to lay down really dense mats, very problematic across the state. In the middle area, we have our water primrose. They are both native and introduced species across the state. We have about um, 12 really common species here in Texas. And as you can see, they also create kind of these really annoying mats that start floating out onto your water surface. It can create a lot of issues depending on what you're using your pond for. And then all the way over on the right, we have American lotus, which looks really similar to water lilies, but American lotus is by far, out of all of the lily-like plants that I see, people have the most issues with them. The leaves become very large. The seeds can actually remain up to or more than 200 years in the sediment. So it's something that you want to get under control very quickly. And I don't mean that to scare everyone, but it's just a little fun fact I like to supply. And just kind of going back to when I was talking about the cattails that were completely covering a pond, what you see over on the right hand side of those American lotus completely covering a pond. Always keep in mind, do your research. You would find that they don't really grow in more than 5 feet of water. And so if it's at the point where American lotus are completely covering your pond, you might want to go in and address kind of the underlying issue there.
Certainly, and those are some aquatic vegetation or aquatic weeds that if you let them get out of hand, they can really take over the pond, and then you really do have a headache, to say the least. And then of course controlling them makes it much harder. So once you do first see them, if it's something especially unwanted, go ahead and clean those out as soon as you can.
Yes, definitely.
So the Aquaplant website, that's aquaplant.tamu.edu. Anybody can access it. It's open to the public. It's very good resource there. Main thing is identifying what kind of plants you have. And as Brittany had talked about earlier on, it divides them into the different categories or types of plants. Then you have some management options on there as well. So Brittany, as we wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to add in?
I would just say that, like you've mentioned before, and we've kind of just forced it into you, remember that there isn't a silver bullet, okay? We don't use the term eradication in aquatic vegetation management. We call it control. Your pond is a man-made structure, and so it's something that you're going to constantly be managing. You do have an average lifespan of your pond, depending on what you're using it for. And, it's one of those things where if you're someone that's wants something low maintenance, I'm not sure if a pond is really for you, but it's really rewarding when you can actually go ahead and, be proactive and make your overall investment into the pond in terms of time and in terms of money, decrease that as much as possible. Just by being proactive, identifying what you're trying to target, because there's again, no silver bullet. There's not one thing I can tell you that's going to treat everything, that's going to manage everything. And everyone's pond is different.
Exactly. And it's an ongoing process. It's a living thing, like you mentioned. And whether you have a pond for recreational use, maybe fishing, or you're using it for livestock and agricultural based enterprises, they all need management, and you have to stay on top of that. So Aquaplant's a great resource. As we mentioned, there on the screen, aquaplant.tmu.edu. If you have other questions, you can always contact our extension office or your local extension office, wherever you may be. Brittany's a great resource. Here in Extension, we can help you try to identify what you have in your pond and get you a recommendation on how to control it. One thing I will mention as we close is some herbicides are restricted use, and you would need to pesticide applicator and license, I guess, if you will. And to get that, if you're interested in getting one of those, we offer a training once a month here in the Taylor County Extension Office, the second Monday of the month. And we get to get you through the training and get you on your way to getting a license if you'd like to do that. One of our future episodes on this new Landowner series, we will cover how to get that pesticide applicator license if you're interested in that. So stay tuned, and we hope to see you on another episode of our new Landowner series. Thanks, Brittany, for joining us today, and hope you learned something about managing your ponds.
Thank you.